October 20th, 1943, Warsaw. The Gestapo kicks down Irena Sendler's door at dawn. The sound of splintering wood, shouting in German, boots on wooden floors. They tear through her apartment, searching for evidence. Drawers yanked open, papers scattered, furniture overturned. She watches, heart pounding in her throat, knowing that if they look under the floorboards, if they find the glass jars buried in her neighbor's garden just 50 feet away, 2,500 children will lose their only chance of ever reclaiming their identities. The names. She's memorized some, but not all. As they drag her down the stairs, breaking her feet and legs with each brutal step, the pain is blinding. But she stays silent. Because Irena Sendler has spent 3 years doing the impossible, smuggling Jewish children out of the Warsaw Ghetto right under the noses of Nazi guards. And today, with her body breaking and her mind screaming, she refuses to let it end. But who was this woman who saved more lives than Oskar Schindler? Why have most people never heard her name? And how did a Polish social worker, not a spy, not a soldier, just a woman with a desk job, manage to orchestrate one of the most daring rescue operations of World War II? Irena Sendler's story is not just about heroism. It's about impossible choices made in impossible times. It's about a network of ordinary people who became extraordinary. And it's about how the truest acts of courage often happen in silence, without medals, without recognition, without anyone watching. In the next hour, you'll discover how Irena went from a social worker helping Warsaw's poor to a master of deception who forged documents, bribed guards, and smuggled babies out in toolboxes and coffins. You'll learn about the heartbreaking decisions parents made to give their children to a stranger, knowing they might never see them again. You'll witness her torture at the hands of the Gestapo, and you'll find out what happened to those 2,500 names hidden in glass jars beneath an apple tree. This is the story of Irena Sendler, a story the Nazis tried to bury, the communists tried to erase, and the world nearly forgot. Let's make sure that never happens again. Chapter 1. The Making of a Rebel. Irena Sendler was born on February 15, 1910, in the small town of Otwock, just outside Warsaw. Poland was a different world then, still recovering from over a century of foreign rule, newly independent, full of hope and possibility. Her father, Dr. Stanisław Krzyżanowski, was a physician, not a wealthy one, not a famous one, just a country doctor who believed that medicine was a calling, not a business. And that belief nearly cost him everything. In 1917, when Irena was just 7 years old, a typhus epidemic swept through their region. Typhus, spread by lice, thriving in poverty and overcrowding, was a death sentence. And the epidemic hit the Jewish community especially hard. Other doctors refused to treat Jewish patients. The risk was too high, they said, the disease too contagious. But Stanisław Krzyżanowski didn't refuse. Day after day, he visited the poorest neighborhoods, the cramped apartments, the families with nowhere to go and no one to help them. He treated everyone, regardless of religion, regardless of ability to pay, regardless of the danger to himself. And then, inevitably, he contracted typhus. Irena was 7 years old when she watched her father die. 7 years old when she learned what it meant to sacrifice for others. 7 years old when she understood that some things matter more than safety. After his death, something remarkable happened. The Jewish community, the same families her father had risked his life to save, offered to pay for Irena's education. They didn't have much. Most of them were poor themselves. But they remembered. They honored the debt. Young Irena never forgot that. Never forgot that her education, her future, her very opportunities existed because her father had chosen compassion over safety. Because people from a different religion, a different community, had shown her family extraordinary kindness. Her father's last words to her became her life's philosophy. If you see someone drowning, you must try to rescue them, even if you cannot swim. Even if you cannot swim, remember those words. They'll matter later. By the 1930s, Irena was studying Polish literature at Warsaw University. Smart, politically aware, and increasingly disturbed by what she was seeing around her. Poland in the 1930s was a place of growing tensions. Anti-Semitism was rising across Europe, and it had infected Polish universities too. Jewish students were forced to sit on separate benches, marked ghetto benches, segregated from their Polish classmates. Irena looked at those benches and made a choice. She took scissors, literal scissors, and began defacing Jewish identity cards, cutting out the Jewish designation. A small act of rebellion, a symbolic gesture, but symbols matter, actions matter. The university suspended her for 3 years. She didn't care. She'd made her point, and she'd learned something important. Sometimes doing the right thing costs you something, and it's worth it anyway. She joined the Polish Socialist Party, where she met others who shared her distrust of authoritarianism, her belief in human equality, her willingness to resist when resistance seemed futile. And she got married to Mieczysław Sendler in 1931, a complicated marriage that would become even more complicated as the world descended into darkness. But let's pause here and talk about the Warsaw that Irena loved. Pre-war Warsaw was one of Europe's great cities. Over 1 million people, vibrant, diverse, modern, and nearly 30% of its population was Jewish. 380,000 people who'd lived there for centuries, who'd built businesses and schools and synagogues, who were woven into the very fabric of the city. Polish Jews, Hasidic Jews, secular Jews, doctors and teachers and shopkeepers and artists. These weren't foreigners, these weren't outsiders, these were Irena's neighbours, her classmates, her father's patients. By 1939, Irena was working as a social worker for Warsaw's Social Welfare Department. Her job was to help the city's poorest residents, Jews and non-Jews alike, access food, housing, medical care. It was unglamorous work, paperwork and home visits and bureaucratic negotiations. But that job, that boring government job with its official papers and access permits, was about to become the most important weapon in her arsenal. Because on September 1st, 1939, everything changed. German tanks rolled into Poland. The Luftwaffe bombed Warsaw. Within weeks, Poland had fallen. Within months, the world Irena knew had ceased to exist. The Nazis didn't just conquer Poland. They wanted to erase it, to turn it into living space for Germans, to enslave its people, to eliminate anyone they deemed undesirable. And at the top of that list were Poland's Jews. At first, the changes seemed bureaucratic. Registrations, restrictions, Jewish businesses marked, Jewish children expelled from public schools, curfews, yellow stars. Each measure alone seemed almost bearable, but together they formed a noose that was slowly tightening. Irena watched it happen, watched her Jewish colleagues lose their jobs, watched families forced from their homes, watched the fear growing in people's eyes, and she asked herself a question. What would her father do? She knew the answer. He would help, he would resist, he would save whoever he could, even if it meant risking everything, even if he couldn't swim. So Irena made a choice, not a dramatic one, not a heroic declaration, just a quiet decision made in the privacy of her own conscience. She would help, whatever it took, however she could. She had no idea that decision would lead her to save 2,500 lives. But here's the thing about Irena Sendler that you need to understand. She wasn't fearless. She was terrified every single day. She later said, "I was taught that a person must be rescued when drowning, regardless of religion and nationality." But notice what she didn't say. She didn't say it was easy, or that she wasn't afraid. She just said it must be done. By September 1939, Irena Sendler was a 29-year-old social worker with a history of small rebellions and a government job that gave her access to places most Poles couldn't go. She had a pen, some papers, and a promise she'd made to her dying father decades earlier. And when German tanks rolled into Warsaw, everything she thought she knew about right and wrong, about courage and consequence, was about to be tested in ways she could never have imagined. The city she loved was about to become a prison, and Irena, she was about to become its secret key. Chapter 2. The Walls Close In. September 27th, 1939. Warsaw falls to the Germans after 3 weeks of bombardment. Over 25,000 civilians dead, buildings reduced to rubble, and the nightmare was just beginning. The Nazis had plans for Warsaw's Jews. Detailed plans, systematic plans. First came the orders. All Jews must register, wear identifying armbands, report their assets, restrictions on movement, restrictions on employment. Then came the next phase. October 1940. The Nazis announced the creation of a Jewish residential district. That's what they called it, a residential district, like it was a neighborhood improvement project. But what they built was a prison, the Warsaw Ghetto, 11 miles of walls, 10 feet high, topped with barbed wire and broken glass, built by Jewish forced labor who were made to construct their own cage. 400,000 people, nearly 1/3 of Warsaw's population, forced into just 1.3 square miles. That's less than 3% of the city's total area. Imagine Manhattan's entire population crammed into a space smaller than Central Park. The walls went up in November 1940, and once they were sealed, the ghetto became a world unto itself, cut off, isolated, a city within a city, except this city was designed to kill its inhabitants through slow starvation. By 1941, conditions inside were hellish, 7 to 8 people living in a single room. Starvation rations, 184 calories per day. For context, an average adult needs 2,000 calories. The Nazis were literally starving them to death. Disease swept through the overcrowded spaces. Typhus, the same disease that killed Irena's father, became epidemic. People died in the streets, their bodies covered with newspaper until the burial carts came. 100,000 Jews died in the Warsaw Ghetto from starvation and disease before the deportations even began, and Irena Sendler had a front-row seat to all of it. Remember her job, social worker for the city's welfare department? That position gave her something invaluable, epidemic control permits. The Germans were terrified of typhus, terrified it would spread beyond the ghetto walls into the Aryan side of Warsaw. So they allowed certain Polish social workers and health officials to enter the ghetto to monitor disease conditions. Irena got one of those permits, and she began making regular visits into the ghetto. Think about what that meant. Irena could walk through the gates that trapped 400,000 people. She could move between two worlds. The normal Warsaw, where Poles still had shops and cafes and lives, and the ghetto where Jewish children starved on the sidewalks. Her first visit broke her. She'd known many of these people before the war, colleagues, neighbors, friends, and now she was seeing them behind barbed wire, emaciated, desperate, children begging for bread, families huddled in doorways, the smell of death and disease everywhere. She later described watching a small child, maybe 4 years old, collapse from hunger in the middle of the street, just fell over, and people stepped around him because this was so common now that it barely registered. That was the moment Irena decided that passive help wasn't enough. Irena wasn't some superhero who fearlessly marched into danger. She was terrified. Every time she walked through those gates, every single time she smuggled something in or out, she was absolutely terrified. She later said, "I was taught that a person must be rescued when drowning, regardless of religion and nationality." But she never said it was easy. She never said she wasn't afraid. In fact, she had every reason to be afraid. Irena had a child of her own, a young daughter. Every time she entered the ghetto, every time she took a risk, she was gambling with more than her own life. She was potentially orphaning her own child to save others. But she kept going back, and she started bringing more than just medical supplies, food hidden in her bags, money tucked into her clothing, and information connecting ghetto residents with the growing Polish underground resistance. She wasn't working alone. She was part of a network. Irena Schultz, another social worker, using her position to smuggle aid. Jadwiga Dineka, forging documents in her apartment. Jaga Piotrowska, who would later risk everything by hiding the most dangerous secret in Warsaw in her garden. Women, mostly women, using the Germans' own sexism against them. The Nazis never imagined that these simple social workers could be master criminals. And then, in July 1942, everything got worse. The Great Action began, the deportations. The Nazis announced that Jews were being resettled to work camps in the East. That was the lie. The official story, the truth, they were being sent to Treblinka, a death camp just 50 miles northeast of Warsaw, sent to be murdered in gas chambers, thousands per day. From July to September 1942, the Nazis deported 5,000 to 7,000 Jews every single day from the Warsaw Ghetto. Think about that number, 7,000 people every day for 2 months. By September 1942, 265,000 Warsaw Jews had been murdered at Treblinka. The ghetto population had been cut by more than half, and everyone who remained knew that they were living on borrowed time. That's when Irena made her next decision. It wasn't enough to smuggle food or money into the ghetto. The people inside were doomed. The deportations made that clear. The only hope was to get people out. But how do you smuggle a living person past armed guards and barbed wire? And more importantly, who do you save when you can't save everyone? Irena looked at the faces around her, the elderly already dying, the adults clinging to hope of survival. And then she looked at the children who hadn't done anything wrong, children who represented not just the present, but the future, if anyone survived to have a future. She made a calculation that must have been agonizing. She would focus on the children. By late 1942, Irena had joined Jagota, the Council to Aid Jews. It was a clandestine organization, part of the Polish underground, dedicated to rescuing Jews from the ghetto. And within Jagota, Irena would lead the children's division. Her mission, get Jewish children out of the ghetto and hide them with Polish families, in orphanages, in convents, anywhere the Nazis wouldn't find them. It sounds almost simple when you say it like that, get children out, hide them. But the reality was anything but simple. Because to save a child from the Warsaw Ghetto, Irena first had to convince a parent to do the unthinkable. How do you convince a mother to hand her baby to a stranger, knowing they may never see each other again? Chapter 3. The Impossible Choice. Picture this scene. It happened hundreds of times, in hundreds of different rooms across the Warsaw Ghetto. Irena Sendler knocks on a door. She's wearing her nurse's uniform, carrying her papers. Official, professional. But when the door opens and she steps inside, everything changes. She's in a single room, maybe 10 feet by 10 feet, and in that room, 3 families, 15 people, sleeping on the floor, on makeshift beds, in shifts, because there's not enough space for everyone to lie down at once. Children everywhere, thin, pale, with the kind of eyes that have seen too much. Irena has come with an offer, an impossible, terrible, merciful offer. I can take your child, she says quietly. I can get them out. And then comes the part that must have shattered her every single time. But I cannot tell you where they're going. I cannot tell you who will hide them. I cannot promise you'll ever see them again. All I can promise is that they'll have a chance to survive. Think about being that parent. You're starving. Your child is dying before your eyes. You know about the deportations. Everyone knows now. You know that staying together probably means dying together. But this woman, this stranger, is asking you to hand over your baby, your toddler, your precious child. And if she's lying, if she's a collaborator, if this is a trap, you've just sent your child to the Nazis yourself. Most parents said no, not because they didn't trust Irena, but because the idea of separation was more unbearable than the idea of death. We stay together, they'd say. Whatever happens, we stay together. And Irena understood. She was a mother too, but she also knew what was coming. She'd seen the deportation numbers. She knew about Treblinka. She knew these children had weeks, maybe days. So she'd come back, visit the same families again and again, building trust, explaining the plan in more detail, showing them the false documents she could provide, and gradually, agonizingly, some parents began to say yes. After the Great Action deportations, when more than half the ghetto's population had been murdered, more parents became desperate. The choice shifted from "should we separate" to "this might be their only chance." But saying yes didn't make it easier. Let me tell you about some of these goodbyes. Elżbieta Fikowska, 6 months old, too young to understand anything except that her mother's arms felt safe. Her mother, Leocadia, made the choice to give her to Irena, 6 months old, an infant who'd never know her real parents. Elżbieta was smuggled out in a carpenter's toolbox. Can you imagine that? A baby, sedated with sleeping medicine so she wouldn't cry, hidden in a box with air holes punched in the sides, carried past Nazi guards who were checking papers and searching bags. If the baby had woken up and cried, it would have been over. The guard would have opened the box, and Elżbieta, Irena, and everyone involved would have been shot on the spot. But the baby stayed asleep. The guard waved them through, and Elżbieta Fikowska survived. Her mother, Leocadia, died in the ghetto 6 months later. Stop and think about this for a moment. You're a parent in the ghetto. You're starving. Your child is dying. A woman you barely know says she can save them, but you'll never know where they go. You might never see them again. And if she's caught, if she's a double agent, you've just handed your child to the Nazis. Would you do it? Could you do it? This is the choice Irena asked hundreds of parents to make. Katarzyna Milok, 6 years old enough to understand that something terrible was happening, but too young to fully grasp what it meant. Irena spent time with Katarzyna before the escape, taught her Catholic prayers, taught her to cross herself the right way, taught her a new name, a new identity. You're not Jewish anymore, Irena had to tell her. You can never tell anyone you're Jewish. Do you understand? Katarzyna, decades later, remembered the moment her mother said goodbye, the embrace that lasted too long, the way her mother's hands trembled, the whispered words, "Be brave, be good, remember who you are." And then Katarzyna walked away with a stranger, out of the only home she'd ever known, into a terrifying unknown. She survived. Her parents did not. Not every story ended with a successful escape. Irena told of one mother who agreed to let her take her child. Everything was arranged, the timing set, the escape route planned. But at the last moment, as Irena reached for the child's hand, the mother changed her mind. "I can't," she sobbed. "I can't do it. I can't let you take him." She called the boy back, held him tight. Irena didn't argue, didn't push. She understood. 3 weeks later, that mother and child were deported to Treblinka, and Irena carried the weight of that moment for the rest of her life. Could she have convinced the mother? Should she have tried harder? Was there anything she could have said? These were the questions that haunted her forever. Some children were too frightened to leave, too attached to their parents. They'd cling and cry and scream, and the sound would draw attention, dangerous attention, and the rescue would have to be called off. And Irena would have to walk away, knowing she was leaving that child to die. Here's what you need to understand about Irena Sendler. Every single child she saved came with a cost. The cost of asking a parent to break their own heart. the cost of lying to children about who they were, the cost of knowing that for every child she saved, there were 10 more she couldn't reach, but she kept doing it, kept making the offer, kept organizing the escapes. By the end of 1943, Irena's network had saved approximately 2,500 children. Some sources say up to 3,000, but the exact number is uncertain because the chaos of war destroyed many records. 2,500 children, ranging from newborns to teenagers. Each one needed false identity documents, baptismal certificates, Aryan appearance papers, a hiding place, a family willing to risk their lives, teaching in Catholic customs and prayers, a new name to remember and an old name to forget. And all of this had to be organized by a network of maybe 20 to 25 co-conspirators, mostly women, social workers, teachers, nurses, using their harmless positions to run one of the most sophisticated smuggling operations of the war. The parents made their choice. They said goodbye. But getting the children out, that required an entirely different kind of courage and an entirely different set of skills. Irena Sendler was about to become one of the greatest smugglers in history, and her methods, they were as creative as they were desperate. Chapter 4. The Art of Deception. The Warsaw Ghetto had 22 official gates, all of them guarded by German soldiers and Polish blue police. Leaving the ghetto without permission meant instant death. Getting caught helping someone escape meant torture, then death. And Irena Sendler crossed those gates almost every single day for 3 years. How did she do it? The answer is ingenuity, bribery, audacity, and an intimate understanding of human nature, specifically what scared the Nazis most. Let me walk you through Irena's methods. And I promise you, some of these will seem almost unbelievable, but they're all documented. They all happened. Method 1. The Epidemic Control Permit. Remember Irena's official job? Social worker checking for typhus and other diseases? That permit was pure gold. It allowed her regular access to the ghetto. The Germans waved her through because they were terrified of typhus spreading to the Aryan side of Warsaw. But here's the beautiful part. Irena exploited that fear ruthlessly. She'd carry medical bags, official-looking documents, and hidden inside, forged papers, money, identity documents, sometimes even food. And when she left, sometimes she'd have a child with her, dressed in miniature nurse or doctor clothes, carrying a little medical bag. "My assistant," she'd tell the guards, in training. The guards barely looked. A child in a medical context didn't register as suspicious. Method 2. The Toolbox. This is the one that saved baby Elżbieta Fikowska. Irena worked with a Polish carpenter named Henryk Wolinski. His job gave him access to the ghetto. He was doing repair work on buildings, and he carried a large toolbox with compartments and air holes that looked like they were part of the design. Infants were sedated, just enough to keep them quiet, not enough to harm them. Irena later said this was the most terrifying part. Too much sedation and the baby dies. Too little and they wake up crying and everyone dies. The baby would be placed in the toolbox, hidden under a false bottom with tools on top. The carpenter would walk past the guards, toolbox in hand, and on the other side of the wall, a Polish family would be waiting to take custody of a child they'd never met. Method 3. The Courthouse Connection. There was an old courthouse on the border between the ghetto and the Aryan side. Technically, part of it was in each zone. Irena's network discovered they could move children through the courthouse during shift changes, those brief windows when one set of guards was leaving and another was arriving, and no one was paying attention. Older children, who could walk and follow instructions, would be coached. Walk slowly. Don't run. Don't look scared. If anyone asks, you're visiting your father who works in the courthouse. Method 4. The Ambulance. Irena would sometimes call in fake medical emergencies. A child infected with typhus who needed immediate transport to an Aryan side hospital. The Germans didn't want diseased children in the ghetto, too much risk of spreading illness, so they'd approve the transfer. The ambulance would arrive, a child would be loaded in, covered with blankets, face red with fever, actually just makeup, and the ambulance would drive through the gates to a hospital, which was actually a safe house. Here's what makes Irena's operation so remarkable. It wasn't just about getting children out. That was only step one. She then had to place them with families or convents, forge their new identities, teach them Catholic prayers and customs, and somehow keep track of who everyone really was. Because Irena made a promise to those parents, a promise that seemed impossible to keep. Method 5. The sewer system. This was the most dangerous method and the most horrifying. Warsaw had an extensive sewer system, and some of those sewers ran under the ghetto walls. For older children, teenagers who could handle the physical and psychological horror, escape through the sewers was an option. Picture this: you're 13 years old, you've been told you're going to escape, and then someone lifts a manhole cover and tells you to climb down into darkness. The sewers were filled with waste, rats, toxic fumes. You had to crawl through filth for hours, in complete darkness, following a map you memorized in your head, hoping you wouldn't get lost or stuck or collapse from the fumes. Some children did get lost, some died down there, but many made it through. Method 6. The coffin. Yes, coffins. The Nazis allowed the burial of dead bodies outside the ghetto. There was a Jewish cemetery on the Aryan side, and burial carts were permitted to pass through the gates. Sometimes those corpses were sedated children. Irena later said this method terrified her more than any other. What if the child woke up early? What if they panicked? What if the burial detail was searched more thoroughly than usual? But it worked, multiple times. Children died in the ghetto and were buried on the Aryan side, where they woke up in a new life. Method 7. The distraction. Irena had a dog. She trained that dog to do something very specific: bark at German soldiers. On certain operations, she'd bring the dog with her. At a crucial moment, when a child was being moved, when papers were being passed, the dog would start barking aggressively at the guards. The guards' attention would shift. They'd focus on controlling the dog, on Irena apologizing and pulling it back. And in those few seconds of distraction, someone else would slip past with a child hidden under their coat, in a bag, in their arms. Simple, brilliant, terrifying. Method 8. The body count deception. This one shows just how systematically organized Irena's operation was. Remember, the Germans were tracking everything, counting people, monitoring deaths. They had records, statistics, bureaucracy. So when children disappeared, Irena had to account for them somehow. She would register more deaths in her typhus reports than actually occurred. If 3 people died, she'd report 5. Those 2 extra deaths were children who'd been smuggled out. On paper, they were dead. In reality, they were living under new names on the Aryan side. The Germans never noticed. They expected high death rates in the ghetto. A few extra corpses on a report didn't raise suspicion. Now all of this required perfect timing, perfect coordination, perfect nerves. Irena used code names. Hers was Jolanta. She created elaborate systems of codes and signals with her co-conspirators. A certain phrase meant abort the mission. A different phrase meant proceed. Every operation had a window of maybe 10 to 15 minutes. That's how long they had from when the child was picked up to when they had to be through the gates. Minutes could mean life or death, and there were close calls. So many close calls. A guard who decided to search more thoroughly than usual. A child who started crying at the wrong moment. A piece of paperwork that didn't look quite right. Each time Irena had to think on her feet, bribe the guard, comfort the child, forge a new document on the spot. She later said she aged decades during those 3 years, but getting the children out was only half the battle, because once they were on the Aryan side, they needed to disappear, completely, permanently. They needed new identities, new families, new lives, and they needed to be taught how to be someone they weren't. Jewish children had to learn Catholic prayers, had to learn to cross themselves the right way, had to learn their new names so thoroughly that they'd respond instantly, even when startled awake, because one mistake, one slip, and they'd be discovered. Irena placed children with Catholic families who agreed to hide them, convents and orphanages run by sympathetic nuns, individual nuns who took children into their personal care, Polish families who pretended the children were relatives from the countryside. Every family that took a child was risking their lives. If caught hiding Jews, the entire family would be executed. Parents, children, grandparents, everyone. And yet hundreds of families said yes. Father Marceli Godlewski at St. Florian's Church provided hundreds of false baptismal certificates. Each one was a real document, entered into church records, backdated to make it look legitimate. Those certificates were lifelines. With a baptismal certificate, a child could get a ration card, attend school, exist in public without raising suspicion. Every child who made it out was a miracle, but Irena knew that miracles weren't enough. Somewhere, somehow, she had to preserve their real identities. Because what good was saving a Jewish child if they could never know who they were? This is where Irena did something that seems simple but was absolutely brilliant. And it's the reason you're watching this video right now. Chapter 5. The Jars of Life. Let me tell you about the most dangerous thing Irena Sendler ever did. Not the smuggling, not the bribing of guards, not walking into the ghetto every day knowing she could be shot at any moment. The most dangerous thing was this. She kept a list. A detailed, comprehensive, damning list of every child she'd saved. Their real Jewish names, their false Polish names, where they were hidden, who was hiding them. If the Nazis ever found that list, it would lead them directly to 2,500 children and the hundreds of families hiding them. It would destroy everything, everyone. So why did she keep it? Because Irena made a promise to the parents who gave up their children, a promise she intended to keep no matter what. After the war, she told them, you will find them. I will help you find them. But how could she help reunite families if she didn't know where the children were, if she didn't have their real names? So she kept records. The lists were written on thin tissue paper in tiny, cramped handwriting. Each entry contained the child's real Jewish name, their false Polish name, their current address, contact information for the hiding family, sometimes notes about siblings or parents. She wrote in code when she could, abbreviated information, but it was all there, every single child, documented, traceable, and then she had to hide these lists. Think about this. Irena was risking her life every day. She could have stopped at just saving children, but she went further. She created evidence that could destroy her entire operation, that could get her killed, that could lead the Nazis to every single child. Why? Because she believed that identity matters, that heritage matters, that even if these children never saw their parents again, they deserved to know their real names. That level of foresight, that commitment to the future when the present was hell, that's what makes her story extraordinary. Irena put the tissue papers in glass jars and metal containers. She sealed them carefully, trying to make them waterproof, and then she buried them. One set went into her neighbor Jaga Piotrowska's garden, under an apple tree. Another set was hidden under the floorboards in her own apartment. Some of the names on those lists: Elżbieta Fichowska, the baby in the toolbox; Katarzyna Meloch, 6 years old, who learned Catholic prayers; Piotr Zettinger, smuggled out through the sewers; Beata Koppel, hidden in a convent for 3 years, each name representing a life, a family, a future. Irena lived with the weight of those lists for 3 years. She'd wake up in the middle of the night in a panic. Did I bury them deep enough? What if someone digs there? What if I forget where I put them? What if the rain ruins the paper? She memorized as many names as she could, but there were too many. She couldn't hold 2,500 identities in her head. The psychological burden must have been crushing. Every time she walked past Jagger's garden, she knew what was buried there. Every time she stepped on her own floorboards, she felt the weight of those hidden papers. One mistake, one search, one suspicious neighbor, and it would all be over. But she also felt pride in what she'd created, this elaborate system of documentation, this commitment to preserving identity even when the world was trying to erase it. The Nazis wanted to make these children disappear, to wipe them from existence, to deny they'd ever been Jewish, ever been individuals, ever been anything but numbers. Irena refused to let that happen. Those jars weren't just lists, they were testimonies, proof that these children existed, proof that they mattered, proof that someone remembered. For 3 years, Irena Sendler lived a double life. Social worker by day, smuggler by night, keeper of 2,500 secrets, but she wasn't invisible. Someone was watching, and on October 20th, 1943, her luck ran out. What happened next would test everything she believed about courage, about sacrifice, and about how much pain one person can endure without breaking. Chapter 6. Pawiak Prison. October 20th, 1943. 5 in the morning. Warsaw is still dark. Irena Sendler is asleep in her apartment when she hears it, the sound that everyone in occupied Poland fears. Heavy boots on the stairs, multiple men, moving fast, and then bang, 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 Aufmachen, Gestapo. Open up, Gestapo. In that instant, Irena knows. This is it. This is the moment she's been dreading for 3 years. She has seconds to think. The lists. Are they safe? Did I hide everything? What did I leave out? The door crashes open. Gestapo officers pour into her small apartment, shouting in German, weapons drawn. They tear the place apart, drawers yanked from dressers, books thrown from shelves, furniture overturned. They're searching for evidence, documents, lists, anything. Irena stands there watching her life being destroyed in real time, and she's doing the calculation. Did they find anything? Can they connect me to the network? Do they know about the jars? They find nothing, because Irena was too careful, too thorough. The evidence is buried in a garden 50 feet away, and under her floorboards in a hiding place the Gestapo doesn't find. But they don't need evidence. They have suspicions. They have reports. They know she's been going into the ghetto. They know she's connected to the resistance, and that's enough. They arrest her, handcuff her, and drag her down the stairs. Irena later described this moment. The stairs were narrow and steep, and the Gestapo officers deliberately threw her down them step by step, breaking her legs and feet as they went. The pain was excruciating, bones snapping, unable to walk, unable to stand. But she didn't scream, didn't cry out, because screaming might alert the neighbors, might bring attention, might lead them to ask questions and find those jars. She's thrown into a truck and driven across Warsaw to Pawiak Prison. If you were Polish during World War II, Pawiak Prison was your worst nightmare, a place people entered and rarely left alive. Pawiak was where the Gestapo took political prisoners, resistance fighters, people they wanted to interrogate, people they wanted to break. 37,000 Poles passed through Pawiak during the war. 17,000 were executed there. Irena Sendler was now prisoner number 7,706. The interrogations began immediately. They wanted names, addresses, contacts. They wanted to know about the children, about Żegota, about the network. Who are you working with? Who helped you? Where are the children? Over and over, for hours, for days, for weeks, and when questions didn't work, they used torture. They beat her. They broke her legs further. Bones that had been fractured in the arrest were now shattered completely. They broke her feet, methodically, bone by bone. Irena later said the physical pain was indescribable. She would carry the effects for the rest of her life, walking with difficulty, chronic pain, permanent disability. But worse than the physical torture was the psychological warfare. The Gestapo interrogator learned what mattered to her, and he used it. "You only have to give us one name," he said. "Just one child, one address, and this stops. All of this stops." Think about that. One word, one name, and the pain ends. She could have ended her suffering with a single word, and she said nothing. Not because she was fearless. She was in agony. She was terrified. She wanted it to stop more than anything. But 2,500 children's lives depended on her silence, and she loved them more than she loved her own safety. She was in Pawiak for 3 months. During that time, she met other prisoners, other resistance fighters, other people who'd been caught trying to do the right thing. There was solidarity among the prisoners. They'd whisper to each other through cell walls, share food when they could, offer comfort in the darkness. But there was also horror. Irena heard the executions, the gunshots, the screams. She knew many of those people, other members of Żegota, other social workers, people from her network who'd been caught, and she lived with the guilt. Did I lead the Gestapo to them? Did my arrest compromise the network? In January 1944, Irena was sentenced to death. She was scheduled to be executed by firing squad. The date was set, the paperwork processed. She spent her last night, what she thought was her last night, thinking about the children, hoping the lists were still hidden, praying someone would find them after the war. She thought about her own daughter, about her father, about all the people she was leaving behind, and she made peace with it. If her death meant the children lived, it was worth it. February 1944, execution day. Guards came to her cell, pulled her out. She couldn't walk, her legs were too damaged, so they dragged her. Down corridors, through the prison, outside. She was expecting the courtyard, the wall, the firing squad. But that's not what happened. The guards took her to a side door, and then they let her go. Just left her there, at a bus stop, in the middle of Warsaw. Irena stood there, barely stood really, leaning against the wall, completely unable to comprehend what had just happened. Here's what she didn't know. Żegota had bribed a guard, 32,000 zloty, roughly $6,400 in 1943 dollars, a massive sum. The guard had listed Irena as executed in the official records. As far as the Gestapo knew, she was dead, shot, buried in a mass grave. But in reality, she was free, broken, injured, barely able to walk, but alive.
I w 1943 roku, w październiku, w dniu akurat moich imienin, przyszło po mnie Gestapo. Oczywiście zostałam zaaresztowana. Ta pani, która mnie wydała, nie wytrzymała bicia, wydała moje nazwisko, więc oczywiście Niemcy wiedzieli, że ja jestem w jakiejś organizacji, która pomaga Żydom. Bili, torturowali, stąd moje chore nogi i bardzo krótko dostałam wyrok śmierci. Grypsy szły, liściki konspiracyjne między Żegotą a mną na Pawiaku. Żegota robiła wszystko, żeby mnie wydostać. Nie tylko przez sympatię do mnie, ale ja miałam, jedyna osoba, która miałam zaszyfrowane 2,5 tysiąca dzieci żydowskich umieszczonych w rozmaitych miejscach, w klasztorach, u osób prywatnych. I ta kartoteka była u mnie w domu. Dzięki wielkiemu przypadkowi ona się do rąk niemieckich nie dostała. Więc Żegota wiedziała, że jeżeli ja zostanę zabita, to 2,5 tysiąca dzieci żydowskich nigdy nie trafi do społeczności żydowskiej, dlatego że tej kartoteki nikt nie wiedział, gdzie ona jest zaszyfrowana. Kartoteka to znaczy wąskie paseczki papieru, gdzie było napisane, że powiedzmy Marysia Kowalska to się równa Racheli Rosenberg, ukryty powiedzmy w klasztorze sióstr takich i takich, prawda. Więc osoba moja była osobą, którą zależało, żebym ja żyła. Wobec tego Żegota robiła wszystko grobelnie, żeby mnie z tego pewniaka wydostać.
Irena limped away from that bus stop into the ruins of Warsaw, using a false identity for the rest of the war. And incredibly, impossibly, she continued her resistance work, even after torture, even after Pawiak, even knowing the Gestapo thought she was dead and would kill her immediately if they realized their mistake. She kept fighting, but Irena survived. The lists were still hidden, and that meant the children still had a chance. The war, however, had one more nightmare to deliver. Chapter 7. The Second Silence. August 1st, 1944. The Warsaw Uprising begins. 63 days of brutal urban warfare as Polish resistance fighters try to liberate the city before the Soviets arrive. Irena Sendler, still recovering from her torture, still walking with difficulty, survives in hiding with false papers while Warsaw burns around her. 200,000 people died in the Warsaw Uprising. The city was systematically destroyed by German forces, block by block, building by building. By the time it ended in October 1944, Warsaw was rubble. 85% of the city was destroyed, and Irena had to watch it all, knowing that somewhere in that destruction, under a garden that might no longer exist, were the jars. January 17th, 1945. Soviet forces liberate Warsaw. The war in Poland is over. The Nazis are gone. And Irena Sendler faces a new kind of terror. What if the jars were destroyed? What if someone found them and threw them away? What if the lists are gone? She goes to Jaga Piotrowska's garden, or what's left of it. The neighborhood is damaged, but not completely destroyed. The apple tree is still standing, and Irena digs, her hands in the soil, her broken legs aching, her whole body trembling, and then she finds them. The glass jars, intact, the tissue paper inside, protected from moisture, still readable. Irena later said she wept when she saw those lists, all the names preserved, all the identities saved. She retrieved the second set from under her floorboards, also intact, 2,500 names, waiting. And then came the heartbreaking part. Irena began the work of trying to reunite families. She went through the lists, started searching for the children. Most of the parents were dead, murdered at Treblinka, killed in the ghetto, died in the uprising. Out of 2,500 children saved, the exact number who were reunited with family is unknown, but it was a tiny fraction. Most of the children were orphans, their entire families wiped out, and many of them didn't remember being Jewish. Think about what that means. A child who was taken at age 2 or 3, who lived with a Catholic family for 5 years, who only knows Catholic prayers and Polish customs, and now someone tells them, "You're Jewish. Your real name is different. Your parents are dead. Everything you thought you knew about yourself is wrong." Some children refused to believe it. Some wanted to stay with their adoptive families, the only parents they remembered. It was complicated, painful. There were no easy answers. Irena helped as many as she could, connected children with distant relatives, helped families reclaim their heritage if they wanted to. But the war had broken something that couldn't be fully repaired. And then came another silence. Communist Poland took over, and under communist rule, Irena's story was suppressed. Why? Because highlighting a rescuer of Jews didn't fit the communist narrative. The official story was that everyone suffered equally under the Nazis. There was no special focus on Jewish suffering, no recognition of those who'd risked everything to save Jews specifically. So Irena Sendler, who'd saved 2,500 lives, lived in a tiny Warsaw apartment on a small pension, in poverty, in obscurity. She continued working as a social worker, lived quietly, didn't talk much about what she'd done. In 1965, she was recognized by Yad Vashem as righteous among the nations, Israel's highest honor for non-Jews who saved Jews during the Holocaust. But in the West, almost no one knew her name. While the world celebrated Oskar Schindler, Raoul Wallenberg, other rescuers, Irena Sendler remained unknown. Why? because she was a woman, because she was Polish, not German or Swedish, and because communist Poland kept her story quiet for decades. Irena Sendler saved 2,500 lives and spent most of her life in obscurity. She lived in poverty while other heroes got movies and monuments. She walked with a limp from torture injuries for 50 years and rarely complained. It wasn't until 1999, when 4 high school students in Kansas wrote a play called Life in a Jar, that her story finally reached an international audience. Those students researched her story for a History Day project. They were stunned that they'd never heard of her. They wrote a play, performed it, and suddenly the world started paying attention. Irena was 89 years old. In 2003, Poland finally gave her their highest honor, Cavalier of the Order of the White Eagle. In 2007, she was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. She lost to Al Gore. When told she was a hero, Irena said, "I could have done more. This regret will follow me to my death." More. She wanted to have done more. This woman who saved 2,500 children thought she hadn't done enough. Irena Sendler died on May 12, 2008, at age 98 in Warsaw. Some of the children she'd saved, now elderly themselves, attended her funeral, carrying flowers. Remember that moment we started with? October 20th, 1943, the Gestapo at her door. Now you know what was at stake. Now you know what she refused to reveal, even under torture. Those glass jars buried in a garden weren't just lists of names. They were lifelines stretching across an abyss of horror into an uncertain future, and Irena held on to them with everything she had. Today there are thousands of people walking this earth in Israel, Poland, the United States, across the world, who exist because of Irena Sendler. Children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, entire family trees that would have been cut down in the Holocaust's machinery of death. She didn't save them for glory. She saved them because, as her father taught her, when someone is drowning, you jump in, even if you can't swim, even if the current is stronger than you, even if you might drown too. You jump. Irena Sendler once said, "Every child saved with my help is the justification of my existence on this earth and not a title to glory." If this story moved you, hit that like button and subscribe to WW2, Untold Heroes and Villains. We're bringing you the stories history tried to bury, the heroes and villains who shaped our world in ways we're still discovering. Drop a comment. Who should we cover next? What untold story needs to be heard? And remember, Irena Sendler's story was almost lost forever. Don't let it be forgotten again.